The Commonwealth never proved in this case that Christine Ricci intended to kill her husband. Admittedly, though, in order to see that clearly and extract that truth, we need to dig through and sift the mountain of dirt they were allowed to come in and dump on Christine Ricci in this case. We need to look through it, sift it, and categorize it, and put it in bins so that we understand what it is. And once we understand what it is, we can deal with it, and we can clear it away, and we can start talking about what happened on January 28, 2021. So let's start by talking about all that dirt, and then I'll get into the events of January 28th, which are the critical period of time that this entire case is about. As I told you, every answer to every question that we have is contained about a 15-minute period on that night. But before we get there, we need to talk about the stuff that they spent most of the case talking about. Amongst the dirt that they piled up in this courtroom, I think you can sort of separate it into essentially four bins. There's the bruise stories that you heard about. There's the suicide attempts. There's the implication that there was some controlling behavior on the part of Christine relative to Michael. And there was all the stuff about Janine Bouchard. And I want to talk about each one of them in turn because I think it's important to get and figure out exactly what's being said and what was exactly presented to you. In the first bin, we talk about the bruise stories. And what are they? Basically, we had 5 people testify about bruising. But just because 5 people testified about bruising doesn't mean that there were 5 bruises. What do we know? Sophia was the first person to testify, and she said that sometime about 2 years before her father's death, which would have been in the beginning of 2019, she heard that an argument had occurred, and then shortly afterwards saw a bruise on the side of her father's face, near his eye, and a fat lip. Katrina Freeman came in and testified, and she said she remembers an incident in which the parties were fighting. And during the fighting, the parties went outside, and shortly afterwards, she saw Christine come back inside the house complaining about her hand. And when asked how she hurt her hand, she said, "I hit him in the face, and that's how I hurt my hand." She also testified on cross-examination that afterwards, Ms. Ricci was wearing a cast for a period of several weeks, and that Michael Ricci, when she saw him the next day, had a bruise on the side of his face, near his eye, and a fat lip. Michael Ricci Jr. testified that he, when he was still living in the house, which we know was before June of 2019, was in his bedroom looking outside the window when he observed his parents leave the house and continue an argument that had happened starting inside, outside. And as he's viewing that house, he sees Ms. Ricci strike Big Mike. So essentially we have an event that occurs either at the end of 2018 or 2019. It happens outside the house. That's consistent with both Katrina's version of the event as well as Michael Jr.'s version of the event. We have bruising in the very same area, in the area by the eye and a fat lip. Then we have the testimony from Mark McDonald. Now, there's a few things that we learned from Mark McDonald. One is that he's no good at timeouts. But there's a few things that we know about when he would have made his observations. And we have that information as a result and as a benefit from little Michael's testimony. And the testimony is this. We know that Max says Michael's work with his company, MCC, began to taper off after he had a conversation with Big Michael about Michael's plans to leave his marriage. We know from other testimonies that that was in October of 2018. And we know that the tapering down of the work started then. And we know that Michael Jr. started working for MCC starting at the beginning of 2019. And by then, Big Michael was no longer working for him. We know that Mr. McDonald's observations occurred during a period of time in which Michael Sr. was working for him. that puts the timing sometime at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And what does he see? Well, he said a lot of things, but basically what he said was he saw bruising, fat lip, and then he mentioned some involvement about the nose. Now, you can decide whether or not Mark McDonald was trying to gild the lily with some of those observations. It's not consistent with the people who were living in the house with Michael Sr. at the time, who just noticed the bruising. But all of those puzzle pieces fit together. They all take place in the end of 2018, the beginning of 2019. And they involve a fight that starts in the house and goes outside, and there's a hitting event. That is the same event. Katrina's saying that she sees the party or she hears the parties leave the house. That puzzle piece fits perfectly with Michael Jr.'s observations from his bedroom window of the fight that is coming from the inside to the outside in the hitting event. What about Matt? We then heard from Michael Dillon. He made sort of an interesting set of observations about bruising. Doesn't attribute the bruising to anything, but he does say that in one instance, which he places sometime in mid-2019, although he's thinking back without any sort of temporal landmarks, that he sees two black eyes. And then he says, several months before Michael Sr.'s death, he sees one black eye. And then shortly before Michael Sr.'s death, he sees some scratches. But that doesn't make any sense, given the observations of the people that were living in the house with Michael at that time. Remember Katrina Freeman saying she saw one bruise during that time. She'd see him pretty regularly. You heard Angel saying he would see him 3 or 4 times a week. Didn't see 2 black eyes and then 1 black eye. I'm not suggesting that Michael Dillon was lying or that he was wrong about all of it, but is it possible that perhaps he may have mixed the order of those 2 events? Now, remember, we heard from Angel that probably about a year before his dad's death, his dad got septum surgery. And as a result of that, there was some swelling around his nose and some blackening of both eyes. Is it possible that what Mike Dillon is remembering is 2 separate events, but in the opposite order? One that happens not in the middle of 2019, but closer to the beginning of 2019. This would have been a time when Michael was working for Michael Dillon. Could he have seen the very same bruises that were described by Katrina and Sophia and Michael Jr. from that same fight outside the house that went from the inside to the outside, where Christine struck Michael, he got some swelling in his eye and a fat lip, and she broke her hand? And is it possible that that second event actually happened afterwards, maybe about a year before Michael's death, when he came in with 2 black eyes? That would be consistent with all the other evidence you heard in the case. And if it's true, it means you heard an enormous amount of evidence about bruising that all relates back to this one period of time, right at the end of 2018, the beginning of 2019, in which they got into a fight. And no one is justifying hitting anybody. Christine didn't make the right choice when she did that, but it's multiply attested by several witnesses that it happened. But it happens in this one instance. Yes, there are some other. There is the testimony of Michael Jr. that in the week or so before his father's death, he went and spoke with his father, and although he had never mentioned it before, as he's picturing him in his mind, he may have noticed under one of the bags of his eyes that there was something that looked like a bruise, without any attribution. But it's funny, because he was working with Michael Dillon at that time. Michael Dillon doesn't mention black and blue a week before. He was living with Angel. Angel doesn't mention black and blue a week earlier. He was living with Sophia, who was seeing him almost daily when he wasn't working. And remember, he was home a lot. He only worked, 1 day on, then he had 2 days off, then he would have 1 24-hour shift on, and then 4 days off. And although he may have done some side work here and there, it wasn't the same as when he was working for Mac, when he was working all the time in his sprinkler installation. That's what the evidence was. So at this point, he's home a lot. She's seeing him a lot. Angel's seeing him when he's home. Katrina's seeing him a lot all the way through December of 2020 when she leaves the house. Then we have all the evidence of the second bin, the suicide attempts. You heard about that. In that bin, I count 3 events. There is, let's start with the last one, the Christine Ricci testimony. She testified that on May 10th, 2020, there was a suicide attempt in which Christine grabbed a knife, held it to her wrist, in the combined living room, dining area room of the house, right outside of the bathroom in that room. That's one. Let's go back in time about a year before that to June 6, 2019. And I'm going to suggest that the evidence suggested that there were 2 suicide attempts on that day. We have the testimony of Michael Ricci Jr. And what was his testimony? What were his observations? He said he was home. He said his mother was home. They were watching TV together. She went upstairs to take a nap, and shortly thereafter, his father got home. His father asked, "Where's your mother?" He said, "Upstairs." And the father went. Michael Sr. went upstairs. Shortly thereafter, Michael begins to feel the house shaking and hears loud voices, and he goes upstairs to confront the couple who are fighting. When he gets there, his mother's upset. She's crying. They seem to be talking about the affair. And she says the words, "Get out." Maybe at Michael Jr., maybe at Michael Sr. But Michael Sr. leaves and goes downstairs. At that point, Christine apparently closes the door, and they're having a yelling match between a closed door. At a certain point, Christine has had enough of this back and forth, and she walks out and goes downstairs, and she goes to the kitchen, and she grabs a knife. And the testimony of Michael Jr. was that she either grabs a knife from the magnet holding the knives or the block of knives. And she's holding the knife, he says, like this, with the blade outward. He's within feet of her. He's within feet of her. He says within 3 feet. He's within essentially gravity distance of Christine. When he sees her get the knife, his testimony is he immediately grabs her. She only gets 2 steps away from that block of knives before he stops her. And he puts her arms behind her back, and he restrains her, and he brings her over to a chair, and he sits her down, and she's crying, and she's upset, and she's saying, "Get off of me," and eventually she drops the knife. And when she drops the knife, she says these words, "Why won't they let me kill myself? Why won't they let me kill myself?" Shortly after that, Angel comes home. He gets a call. Maybe it's from Michael Jr., maybe it's from one of the parents, but he gets a call. He's at work. He gets a call or he gets a text. Come home. There's been a big fight between the parents and Michael Jr. He comes home. And he's mad. He's pissed. He also has had enough of the turmoil about the affair and the fact that there's arguing now between the kids and the parents. And when he gets home, he goes right up to the parents' room, which is where the 2 of them are. And they're both sitting on the floor. And in Michael Jr.'s story, just before he goes downstairs, Christine smashes a mirror. And what Angel's story is that when he walks in the room, the glass in the mirror is still on the ground. So the 2 stories match up practically completely. He says at that point, he gets into a yelling argument with his parents, and that sets his mother off, and she goes downstairs again. And this time she grabs a knife and she holds it to her stomach, almost like the way that he said, as if to poke herself, or the way that the Japanese person would commit suicide. You know, it creates an image of what he was talking about. And then he says he restrains her, and his father takes the knife out of her hand. You heard the testimony of Lee Rivera about that very same incident, and what does Lee Rivera say? Lee Rivera says, well, when we asked him about it, she said, I want to make sure I get this right. She says, maybe I'm better off dead. That was her description of those 2 events. So we have these 3 events that all take place. And don't forget, during Michael's story, after she says the words, "Why don't they let me kill myself?" he walks upstairs behind her because he's so nervous that she might do something to herself. And then we have the third bin, which is the bin where we have all the information that the Commonwealth wants to put on about the controlling behaviors. And what exactly are the controlling behaviors? The first part is she controlled his phone. What's the evidence of that? Well, the evidence is that Mark McDonald said that he wasn't available on his former number after he left his unemployed. But remember, the phone that he had was a company phone from MCC. And when he stopped working for MCC, he got a new phone. Just like when he stopped working for MCC, a little while later, he got a new truck. There doesn't seem to be anything particularly sinister about that. He got all new friends. Yeah, the testimony was that shortly after the affair was disclosed and the parties and everybody started to talk, Michael admitted that he was an alcoholic and started going to Alcoholics Anonymous. And it seems like he took it seriously. From the testimony of Bobby Higgins, who you saw, he was an enthusiastic participant in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's oftentimes hard for people who were alcoholics because their social lives revolved around drinking. And many of their friends, even if they don't have problems, they're easily able to slip back into the old grooves, the old behaviors. And so it's important, oftentimes when people are trying to get better and trying to get clean, that they start a new set of social habits, new set of social rituals, and even start hanging around with people that, in the words of Bobby Higgins, are on the same path as them. It makes things easy. It makes things easier. And what do we know about Michael Sr.'s life when he was drinking? Well, a lot of his social activities revolved around alcohol. Now, they try to minimize it, but you heard the testimony of both Sophia and Angel. They both had concerns way before he ever said he was an alcoholic. Talked about the fact that he would come home and polish up an 18-pack. And before that, he would oftentimes go to the bar and drink and get warmed up at BBC across the street from MCC, or down the street from MCC. It seems like Michael certainly felt that he had a problem because he said he had a problem. He told people he was an alcoholic. He got involved. He followed the steps. He got a sponsor. He did commitments, which means you go to places and give a speech about your process of getting sober. So we got a whole new group of friends, but that makes sense under the circumstances. You heard from Bobby Higgins that the house at 679 Moraine Street became kind of a hangout for all the people that were in the Sober Softball League and the people at AA. So he wasn't being isolated. He was just fraternizing with a whole new group of people that were on the same path as he was. What's the other evidence? That she would go to AA meetings with him? Well, she didn't go to the men's group with him. She didn't write his commitment speech for him. But Bobby Higgins told you that the AA encourages people, encourages people to bring their family and bring their family along. And Christine did Al-Anon, and even went to Al-Anon with Bobby. She asked questions because she wanted to understand the nature of the 12-step program. She bought books, and she went back to school, and according to Sophia and Angel, she did it with sort of the idea that she was supporting Michael. It seems to me a lot of the stories of control could also be understood as stories of support, depending on what your attitudes were about Christine. And a good way of understanding what witnesses' attitudes were about Christine, a good litmus test is that alcoholism issue. Because when Michael got sober, there were people on board and there were people that weren't on board. Michael McDonald had skepticism, wouldn't admit it on the stand. Then again, he wouldn't admit much of anything. He wouldn't admit that when you're lost, you don't know where you are. His timeline kept moving from year to year. 6 months could be 2 months, depending on what he needed it to be at that moment. But Michael Jr. told you. He said, if I had any doubts when I left, he begrudgingly admitted after talking to Mac, that solidified it. And all the guys that he used to go hang around with also doubted it. They doubted that he was an alcoholic because, after all, according to Mac, he wasn't even a heavy drinker. All he drank was beer. He was the guy. Mac was the guy that drank scotch. And if Mac didn't have a problem, certainly certain Michael didn't. It was all just invented. The final category is the obsession with the affair, or what they call the obsession with the affair. And there's no doubt about the first evidence that the affair absolutely devastated Christine. There's just no question about it. She was initially upset at the betrayal. It sounds like the fact that Michael may have been claiming that he didn't remember certain things, or maybe saying that he didn't remember things that he did remember, was making her doubt, and not knowing if her doubt was true or founded. She wanted to believe in him. She wanted to believe the story he was telling her. But then he would slip up and say something that, didn't fit, and then she would get upset again because she would feel betrayed again. And this was a relationship with a lot of trust issues. All that stuff they talked about control, that's a relationship with trust issues. That's what happens after an affair very often. There's a lot of talk about trust, and when there's lies that come out over time, it makes it very difficult to heal because you don't even understand what it is that you're healing from. And it sounds like that was a lot of what Christine was going through. And I'm not going to argue that Christine did what all of the rest of us would do, where she reacted within an average way. She was absolutely devastated. But that devastation, after early 2019, turned into a focus on trying to figure out what was wrong with Michael. And yeah, there were many people in Michael's life who didn't believe that there was anything wrong with him. They felt that Christine was just making it all up. But Michael was telling her things that made her think that she was missing something, that she didn't understand what was going on, and she was looking for answers. She was looking for answers in the classes she took. She was looking for answers at AA. She was looking for answers at Al-Anon. And she was looking for answers by asking him questions. And yes, the people around it must have seemed like they were having the same fight over and over again. And it must have been incredibly frustrating and terrible to be around. Commonwealth elicited evidence that Christine Ricci was on multiple medications. You heard from Sophia that she had panic attacks. You heard that she had some sort of debilitating arthritis where she would wear a brace. You heard all of this evidence that she was in counseling and therapy. There is no doubt that this affected Christine Ricci. This affair affected her probably more than a completely psychologically healthy person. But the evidence of all that dirt that was presented actually does give you a clue of the direction in which that pain was directed. From about the middle of 2019 all the way through 2020, this was suicidal ideation. This was making her doubt herself, making her wonder whether she was crazy or whether or not what she was hearing from Michael was crazy. And that type of second guessing, constantly second guessing, led her to not doubt the very ground that she was walking on. And she went to Jean's house on 2 occasions. Once they had a long, hour-long conversation. It sounds like it started out emotional. It sounded like it ended with some type of reconciliation, or at least some type of acknowledgement and a hug and a statement of forgiveness. It sounded like most of what she did during that conversation was ask questions that she couldn't get answers to from Michael. Now, we heard from Janine, and obviously Janine plays sort of based on the role that she plays in Christine and Michael's relationship, she may have had a motive to be somewhat self-protective. But what came out was that first conversation ended at a place that was more or less calm, even if it was emotionally kind of all over the place at the beginning. There was one thing that she said. She said, well, I made the statement to her that your marriage was almost over and you had already moved on, and Christine agreed with me. Is that credible given the evidence in the case that was said? given all the evidence you've heard about just how incredibly devastated Christine Ricci was about this affair, that she would have just been like, well, that's true. No. Or does that sound like some sort of self-serving statement of someone who's trying to minimize and mitigate their moral responsibility for something? She could tell the truth while still shading around the edges. Christine hadn't moved on. This marriage wasn't over. Everybody said it was a good marriage. They got along, they were affectionate, they slept in the same bed. This wasn't that kind of thing at all. And she certainly wasn't agreeing that this marriage was almost over, or practically over. But what did come out of the conversation with Janine is that the focus of this conversation was Christine's confusion. And probably most of us would have just stopped asking questions, stopped trying to understand. And it's probably the fact that Christine kept trying to hold on to what he was saying and trying to make sense of it that really did drive her to this extreme of going to see Janine and asking these questions and having this moment where she sat down and talked with her. It also appears that she had a conversation in March of, or she went over to have a conversation in March of 2020. And that conversation really never happened. It was sort of aborted before it ever began. But during that conversation, there was evidence that she was emotional. Yeah, we can't get away from that. She was emotional about it. But what was the nature of the emotion? The emotion was frustration and sadness and depression and anger and incredible feelings of self-doubt, self-hatred, and suicide for that period between 2019 and 2020. But that's about Christine. That's about Christine. And that's what they want this case to be about. A famous English jurist once said that in a criminal case, in a very real sense, the trial isn't about the defendant. It's not the defendant that's on trial. It's the government that's on trial. Because in a very real sense, it's the government's evidence that's on trial in a criminal case. And the question for the jury is whether they presented enough. Was there enough? And our standard of proof, which is the highest standard of proof in the legal system, is that, in fact, you're looking at all this evidence, all you know are things about Christine Ricci, and you know nothing about Christine's intentions on January 28, 2021, or you don't know what happened. Your job is easy. They haven't presented enough evidence. Not enough. If at the end of the evidence you feel like you maybe know what happened on the night of January 20th, based on what the Commonwealth has presented to you, your job is easy. They haven't presented enough. Even if you think it's probable or highly probable what you think might have happened, unless you are sure to a moral certainty, then the answer is easy. It's not enough. It's the government in a criminal case that's on trial. In fact, if there's even one reasonable alternative that fits the evidence, that is a story of innocence, then your job is to say not enough. The government hasn't proven enough. So let's talk about January 28 now, 2021, and talk about a very real possibility of what occurred that day. We know that the arguing may have been going on for some time. It was going on when Sophia got home from school at about 2 p.m. She went upstairs to her room and she was trying not to pay attention. She knew that the parties had been fighting and it was sort of became commonplace at that point. So she just was sort of doing her own thing, not really paying much attention, when all of a sudden she hears banging. She hears banging and the movement of things. And then shortly thereafter, she hears her mother yell, "Call 911." And she comes downstairs and sees her father laying on his side in the living room dining room area. And she calls 911, and you heard the 911 call. You heard the emotion in her voice. You heard that her focus was on talking to the 911 operator and answering his questions. And she had partial information. And you can also, during that call, hear the emotions of Christine. You can hear her crying in the background. You can hear the wailing and the hyperventilating and the crying. And in fact, Christine is still in that position later when other people arrive at the scene. So what can we gather from that? We also know that on the night in question, what's been marked as exhibit number 8 the police find in that area this knife on the ground, right there. And that's right next to a step-up that's about 1 foot, based on the testimony of all of the witnesses who are familiar with the house. And that Michael's foot, when he was found by first responders, was on the bottom of this step right here, or, I'm sorry, on the other side, here. Doesn't it make sense that this argument began to happen? And what do we know based on the prior acts? She's suicidal. She goes to that drawer and she grabs a knife. I'm going to suggest she grabs this knife right here. What's been marked as exhibit number 23, what was marked by forensics as 1-4. And she holds it to herself, as if maybe to her wrist, maybe to her neck. When Michael sees that during the argument, he gets upset, and he runs into that room from the living room, dining room. And he tackles her. And as he's tackling her, she hits the ground. She still has that knife in her hand. As she's plunging that knife towards her own rib cage, just below the breast. And Michael's arms are around her. And that is the first stab wound. She might not at this point even know that she stabbed him. But he knows. All of his adrenaline is going, and now he's focused. He gets up, and maybe he's not gentle with her at all, and it's understandable why he wouldn't be under those circumstances. He's got pain in his shoulder, and he realizes that this is an out-of-control situation. He gets control of that arm. He might grab her to do it. He rips the knife out of her hand and runs over to that drawer, and he grabs all the knives in the drawer. And he runs over to that dining room table, and he throws the knives into the box on top of the dining room table. And then he turns around to see what's going on. By this point, Christine has gotten up off the ground, and she's gone over to that drawer, and she's grabbed another knife, this time a steak knife. This knife right here. This time she's holding the knife to her body, and he goes over, and he starts, this time he doesn't make the mistake he made the first time. He grabs her arm first, controls the arm with the knife, and they start moving around with that knife. And as he tries to twist that arm to get that knife out, the two of them begin to turn with Christine's back right in that doorway, right in front of that step leading down into the combined living room basement. And as she pulls away to get that knife back, the two of them stumble off that ledge onto the floor, and the knife is still between them. He falls in, right into the knife, penetrating the center of his chest. With such force that the soft tissues in Michael's body were compressed, such that the knife wound was longer than the actual blade of the knife causing the wound. At this point, Christine is underneath Michael. The knife is between them, and Michael is on top of her. She is beside herself. She rolls him off of her onto his side, and she gets up, still holding that knife, and drops it, and turns and screams for Sophia to call 911. When 911 arrives and the police arrive, first she talks to Chris Martin. she's so emotional that he doesn't even know really 100% what she's saying. He doesn't have a complete account of what she's saying. What he's able to get out of her is a statement about manic episode and collapse. The idea that this is some sort of a full statement of what happened is ridiculous. She's just been through an incredibly traumatic event. Martin described her as being emotional, heaving, hyperventilating, crying, weeping. There was no way that he could have gotten a complete story out of her. And did she think that part of that event, maybe the part where he was grabbing her to get that knife away from her, was rough and maybe considered in that moment when she's just through a trauma? This whole event was an incredibly exciting, dramatic event. She's not she's an emotionally fragile person, and this has just happened. She may have an accurate memory of it, but she certainly has an incomplete memory of what has just happened. And she's trying to just say what she thinks is relevant through her tears. And Martin, thinking that he's coming to a totally different type of call, is trying to piece together what he's hearing. And he's doing the best he can. It's not his fault. But he only gets a couple things. It's not until later that they bring her into the kitchen. And they sit her down, and Sophia goes and gets her medication, that she begins to say a little bit more. That's why there's no blood on the floor. He landed on top of her. The knife up by the corner of her shoulder. That's where his blood was, right there. And it was on the blade of that knife that went in his body. All the rest of the blood was bleeding internally. You heard the evidence about it. And that's why she might not have even known exactly what happened at that point. There's no blood around. Maybe she herself hasn't looked at herself and done an assessment of what's going on at all. All she knows is this thing just happened, and it was the result of this event, this struggle, which she conceptualized as him attacking her. And again, maybe there was some basis for that, because in a moment of his absolute worry and frustration over the circumstance, he might not have been that gentle. And then she goes to the police station. And they take photographs of her. Then marked as exhibit number 17. What you'll see in picture 17, if you can't see it on this screen, when you look closer at the picture, what you'll see is a large scratch mark. It looks like what was referred to as an incised wound on Christine Ricci's neck. And when they took photographs of her hands, you notice there's some incised wounds here on her arms, and more close up. That event, which began with a suicide attempt and ended with a struggle for the knife, which led the two of them to tumble off that stair, was never intended to be a stabbing of Michael. It was never intentional. The stumble was an accident, and the fall that created the penetrating force to let that knife go into Michael's body was an accident. If the Commonwealth's evidence does not disprove that, they haven't given you enough. And if they haven't given you enough, the way we say not enough in a courtroom is not guilty. Christine Ricci never intended to kill Michael. She never intended to stab Michael. What happened was an incredible tragedy that was the result of everything that was going on in the home for the previous 2 years, but was very specific to the few minutes around that call to 911. And if the Commonwealth's evidence, both forensic as well as testimony, did not affirmatively disprove that story, you must find Christine Ricci not guilty. Thank you.